Hello, hello. 1 o'clock Tuesday breakdown. Hello, world. Um, I wasn't here last Tuesday because I was sick. I had a migraine, and the staff told me I had to go home during our staff meeting. And they were right to do so because I couldn't see straight. So, apologies if you were looking for me last week to talk about Vision Sunday. I didn't get a breakdown for that. And so today I'm going to talk about Vision Sunday, which was 2 Sundays ago, as well as a little bit about what happened this last Sunday, which was our Super Sunday with a guest missionary preacher and just an awesome mixed service with all three of our services being in one room at one time. So I want to talk about some of that. I want to talk about kind of 2023 as a thing. So where should we start? It's been a while since I did one of these. Because of Christmas season and a week off and all that. So hopefully I can still fill some content that'll be worth your time and worth your while. But I can't promise anything. Anyway, what we're going to talk about first is Vision Sunday. Vision Sunday. Every year, kick off in January with a little bit of a vision sermon. And I always follow the same format on that sermon outline: victories, values, vision. Victories being, what did God do in the last 12 months that we can celebrate? Because it's going to be something, and it might be a lot of something, and it usually is. But it's also a chance for me to do kind of a State of the Union in terms of the business side of church, how we're doing financially, how we're doing in terms of staffing and ministries and things like that. I always love putting together the slide of the sermon series that we did in the previous year. I had no idea that they all had black logos until I saw them all together. And I thought, well, that's no good. We need to have some color in our logos, in our graphics. So you're going to like the Daniel one that's coming this week. It's very colorful and bright. Anyway, we also, I want to talk about this because every church business conversation, every financial meeting I've been a part of, and I'm not on our finance team. I keep a very safe and healthy distance from our bookkeeping, from our money. I get my paychecks, and that's about it. I keep an eye on the line items, but I am not in charge of money, and I don't want to be in charge of money around here. So I don't know who gives what, and I'm perfectly happy about that. But I do want to know, as the senior pastor, where we are financially as a church. And every meeting, there's usually that tug of war between people with a scarcity mindset and people with a plentiful mindset, in the sense of, do we think about money as a church from a place of there's only so much, we have to be extra careful with it, or God will always provide, and so let's operate on faith and let's go forward? And I totally get both sides. The Bible has so much to say about wisdom with finances. In fact, Jesus taught more about money than he did about heaven and hell put together. So when it comes to being wise with money, that is a non-negotiable in a church setting. How the church handles money is a massive evangelistic either stumbling block or tool. In fact, I remember when we planted in the 90s, a couple of us went to O'Hare. We were in Chicago planting in the north suburbs of Chicago. But we went to O'Hare just to get some data. And we clipboard, and I was one of those obnoxious guys who would interrupt people walking through the airport. And I remember the question we started with: do you attend a church regularly? And then if they said yes, there was follow-up questions. If they said no, there were follow-up questions. And the no first question was always, why not? Right? Is there a reason? And then we kept tabs of answers and put it into our data mining for how we wanted to promote and launch this church. But the number one answer why people didn't go to church, and this was 1993, 1994, by a wide margin, was the church only wants my money. Which kind of makes sense coming out of the 80s televangelist scandals. the theme of the time was churches are just out to steal from weak-minded people, was kind of the idea. And all that to say, from that very young version of myself, I learned very quickly, don't mess around with money. Don't mess around with church money. And I have books here on my shelf that talk about, the 3 big causes for pastors to shipwreck and submarine their ministries and their lives. The 3 great temptations are power, money, and sex. And when it comes to those, it's like boundaries are always good. More boundaries are better. And so that's what it is with me and money. However, and so I get why it's super important as a church to not mess around when it comes to money management, tracking, accountability. Don't mess around. It affects the way people view God himself, how his people who claim his name handle their money affairs. It's super important. And we need to be wise, and we need to be careful. We need to be transparent and all those things. But I'm also wired in such a way, and I think it must be a gift from the Lord. I've never in my life worried about money, personal or church-wide. I've never worried about money. It's only money, and there's always money, has always proven true for me. Now, I didn't grow up in the Depression. I'm not the child of somebody who grew up in the Depression. I am a pastor's kid. We were never wealthy. We were always, growing up, there were things we couldn't get because we didn't have the money. And that was fine. But the scarcity mindset is something I really struggle against when I hear it coming out of believers' mouths. It just reminds me of the parable of the talents and the way the master has given us resources. What are we going to do with them? And the idea of burying them in the backyard because we're not sure there will ever be any more. To me, it just violates what Jesus taught. The idea that we need to save it for an emergency. We need to save up for a rainy day. We need to worry about where the next money is going to come from to be able to pay for X, Y, or Z. Well, did God call us to do X, Y, and Z? Money will be there. He will provide for what he's called us to do. And so I'm usually the guy in those meetings who will push back on the scarcity mindset people in the room. And I don't want to be mean about it, and I'm not always right. Again, it's never to undermine wisdom with money. But in my 10 years here at Grace Church, the only time we finished a calendar year in the red was when we budgeted to finish that calendar year in the red. And that was the 1 year. Every other year I've been here, we finished in the black. And that's whether we had a $1.5 million budget and we were doing multi-site, or on leaner years like COVID. We have always been provided for by God. And so money and me, we get along fine. And I've been accused, and I think correctly, I've been chastised correctly over the years that I tend to be too positive. I am an optimist at heart, and I accentuate the positive. And sometimes I've been accused when I'm doing Vision Sundays or I'm promoting ideas that I'm only giving part of the story because I don't think I spin, but over the years, there have been times where I've probably put too nice of a light on something that maybe I should have given more of the underbelly to get the whole truth out. And I think that's fair. I try not to do that because I was chastised on that a couple years back. But when it comes to money, I don't worry about it. And I don't like it when Christians worry about it. Now, there are things like Financial Peace University, which is a class we're offering here this spring, where people can learn some skills about money that maybe they didn't have before. And I've been through a Dave Ramsey course, and it helped me a lot. So I'm not saying that how you're wired is wrong. I just feel like collectively as a church, the data points that we have all been God will come through faithfully, and we don't need to worry about money. So then when we get into those meetings where we're saying, well, what should we do? How much money should we budget for? Are we sure we can do this? And somebody in there's like, well, we can't budget based on faith. We can only really budget based on real data. I often want to reach across the table and grab them by the lapels and say, the real data is that we can budget by faith. That's what the numbers have said, and that's what they will continue to say, because that's how God meets the needs here at Grace Church, and he always has. So I'm excited. I guess that's the point I want to say. When it comes to church money, we serve the Lord who owns the cattle on 1,000 hills, and he's not short on cash. So we don't need to worry about it. We can plan ahead for positive things to come. And I guess that was what I want to communicate every time I do the victories piece of that message. Now, all that being said, the theme, I think, where we're headed as a church is this concept of things are changing so fast in our world, and in particular, how we would answer the question, how can we be an effective and healthy local church? I think the expectations of super positive, optimistic, everything will go smoothly for us in the future, even though I just said that about the finances, I still think, okay, it is wise to take a look around at our situation and our culture and ask a different set of questions. Because, and I said this in the vision message, and I think I quoted it from maybe this book, the Faith for This Moment book that I mentioned in the sermon, or Larry Osborne's Thriving in Babylon book. But the idea of being culturally respected as a local church of people who take the Bible as the authority for living, finding respect in the culture for having that position is not an expectation we should have anymore. That was the expectation in the mid 20th century. It was the expectation when I was growing up. The way the world is right now, we need to rethink our place in the overall culture. And I think that's what Jesus meant when he said to his disciples, they needed to be shrewd as serpents and yet innocent as doves. That was what he told them as he sent them out into the world. And we have this same open world quest. He has sent us into our city. And I think we need to be shrewd as serpents, but innocent as doves. And I think a lot of my experience in the evangelical world is the shrewdness isn't always there, because we can play to the home crowd. And so we don't need to be shrewd. We can just be loud, or we can be big, or we can be have our own culture where we have our own music, and we have our own books, and we have our own radio stations, and we have our own TV shows, and we have our own movie studios now. And that's not necessarily shrewd. And so to go back to the basic, and I had everybody say this in Vision Sunday, the church doesn't exist for itself. We exist to bless the city where we've been placed. And I think exile thinking is very different than Camelot thinking. Now, I say Camelot, King Arthur, the golden age mythologically of Britain. But I think you can go back to, say, the scriptures of when David was king of Israel. You know, they went through a ton to get to the promised land. And then when they got there, things weren't going very smoothly. And so they demanded a king. And Samuel's like, you really don't want a king, because if you have a king, he's going to do what kings do, which is bad for the people. Why can't we just have God as our king? And the people are like, no, we need to be like the other kingdoms, and we need our own king. And God relented, and Samuel relented, and they got Saul, and that didn't go so great. But then they had David, and it was Camelot. It was peace and prosperity and thriving, and the people of God were the most powerful people on the planet. And they had this great king, David, who was a man after God's own heart. And if you get to live during Camelot, there's a lot to enjoy. And there's a lot of, I'm on top of the hill. Not the way Jesus said we're a light shining on a hill. More like, I'm king of the mountain. My views and values are the powerful views and values of the most powerful empire in the world. And so I get to live large. But after David, And after Solomon, and even, I mean, you could put Solomon in the building of the temple in this Camelot era. After Solomon died and the kingdom split, and the northern kingdom had 0 good kings, and the southern kingdom only had a handful. And then eventually the southern kingdom is conquered by Babylon and taken into exile. That's a different posture to be the people of God in that culture versus the people of God during the time of Camelot and the time of David and Solomon. And so now, how do you be the people of God? And I don't think it's a stretch to connect where American Christianity has been to where American Christianity is going, to that storyline. I don't think it's a stretch to connect it to that storyline. And in fact, the exile, strangers, aliens, interlopers within an antagonistic culture is much more the norm for the church throughout history than the exception. The exception is those rare occurrences where Christianity is the way of the culture. The norm is that, no, we're in exile. This is not our home. Our citizenship is in heaven. And to be the church in a culture that is against the things that the church believes and values, where the respect isn't there just naturally, is much more normative. And it certainly was in the first century. It certainly was during the church's explosion. It certainly has been globally for the church throughout all of history. And even today, for most of the church outside of the West, this is the experience. So how can we prepare ourselves? And that's kind of the vision idea of Vision Sunday. So what is it that our posture ought to be? And that's why I'm excited to talk about Daniel, because I think in Daniel, you get this great cross-section of being wise, that shrewdness. Multiple times here in Daniel chapter 1, which I'm going to preach this Sunday, it talks about the wisdom of Daniel and how he gained favor with Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians by being wise. I think that's that shrewd as serpent thing. Daniel modeled that. But there's also moments in Daniel where they had to resist. And the resistance wasn't to spark a revolution. It wasn't to be the destroyer ship that blows the other guy out of the water. It was simply honoring God above man, which occasionally caused them high risk. And them, Daniel and his friends. And I think there is something to where we're headed as Christians in the West, where it's going to have to be that mixture of blessing and being wise to gain favor mixed with the occasional resistance. And I think because of the political divide we have right now and because of the very loud preachers in American Christianity who want the resistance to be revolutionary, who want the resistance to be to win through defiance, they're not gaining any respect. They're not gaining any honor inside Babylon. They just want to burn it down. And I don't see that is something God told his people to do in this case historically. I think it's much more of a quiet resistance, an important modeling to the world of where to draw the line, which is very different than we're going to aim our cannons at you because you've aimed your cannons at us. So that boat thing came back, and this was fun. So I've been here 10 years. I've been doing the boat metaphor to explain what kind of church is a healthy biblical church for 10 years, multiple times a year for 10 years. To the point now that we joke about it. You know, Tanya put up a great slide pointing me as a boat enthusiast on my name on that Vision Week. And I talked about how everybody's heard this before, but in case you haven't, here we go. I had so many people come up to me on that Sunday saying, that was the first time I've ever heard that. And I realized all of the preamble and joking about how, yes, we're going to talk about boats again today, and like the setup where I point out how tired everyone is of hearing the boats, it doesn't work anymore because since COVID, we have such a different population. And I really felt like I needed to apologize for that. Like, that's inside baseball talk where we joke about things that we assume everyone in the room knows. And then to realize later, a lot of people in the room didn't know that. So I think for the future, I'm just going to do the boats as if no one's ever heard it before. So I think that honors the people who haven't heard it before. So I felt bad about some of that kind of inside talk, insider language. I should have just come right at the boats. But I kept it to just the destroyer, the submarine, and then the Maid of the Mist, the boat where you actually get wet. But it was funny because I was talking about how you can see Niagara Falls all up and down the Canadian side, and you can see them with binoculars. In some places, you can get right up to where the water falls over the edge. You can get behind the falls. But the only time you really experience the falls and get wet is on that Maid of the Mist. And the idea of get involved in the mission of Jesus. Don't just be a spectator. That was the point I was trying to make. But my kids were laughing because they're like, Dad, you realize the only place you can't actually see the falls in Niagara Falls is when the Maid of the Mist gets under the water. You can't see a thing. It's just blinding mist. You can't see a thing. So it kind of defeated the metaphor if you think about it too hard. But you're actually experiencing them, not just seeing them. And I think maybe that metaphor still works. Anyhow, I thought it was interesting when I was researching the kid who fell over in 1960, because I remember reading about it this summer when we were there. It was on a big plaque. But it didn't really tell a whole lot of the story other than he survived and the Maid of the Mist found him. So I was doing some research to get ready for the sermon so I get his name right. And it turns out he and his sister have a global ministry where they tell this story as divine intervention, and that the whole point was so that he and his sister could be saved eternally, not just from Niagara Falls. That I don't need to tell his story from his perspective, but I thought that's a really cool even wrap up to the metaphor that people in the water need to be saved. Metaphorical water being spiritual death, need to be saved by the gospel. And any one of us who's on the boat is only on the boat because somebody threw us the lifeline of the gospel ourselves. So why would we not want to be on the boat helping others? And that's really the philosophy of church and the philosophy of who we should be as a church. So I feel like I'm rambling on a lot of things here, but that's what the Vision Sunday was about. It was celebrating the victories, not getting worried about God's provision, but celebrating. And that's kind of what the altars were in the Old Testament. When God would come through miraculously, parting the river, Jordan, or meeting his people or doing something miraculous, you build an altar so that you'll remember that God has done that. So your faith later can be based on that precedent. It's not wishful thinking or blind hope. It's, no, he came through before. We can trust he'll come through again. And a lot of those kings of the divided kingdom didn't believe that. I know we worship a God. He might or might not come through. Let's go make a treaty with the Ammonites. Let's go make a treaty with Egypt. And that was when God, through the prophets, are like, what is wrong with you? I check the altars. I come through for my people. Why don't you trust me? Okay, well, if you're not going to trust me, if you're going to trust other nations, then you can go to the other nation and you'll be in exile until you learn to trust me again. And so all of those things are interwoven in how I was thinking about Vision Sunday. Let's celebrate the victories so we can count on him to come through again. But also we need to stop thinking like we're the majority in Camelot. We're not anymore, which means how can we do ministry in a way that'll reach the people he has for us today, which might be Babylonians. So anyway, that's where we're headed in 2023. Hence books like Faith for This Moment, Thriving in Babylon, Christians in the Age of Outrage, all sorts of good books. But I feel it's my job as a pastor to help prepare us as God's people to be effective. And that means I'm going to have to speak against some of the false methods and false teachings that are prevalent in American Christianity today, such as the conspiracy theory, such as the take back our countryism, or we need to fight the government on everything. I could name names of pastors who are doing that, who have a lot of people in his camp who think they're doing the right thing, but I think they need to think more about exile and what God told his people through the prophet Jeremiah and through the prophet Daniel on how to live honorably and impactful and effective and influential lives as the minority, as the interlopers, not as the we need to get Camelot back. Also, in Daniel, we're going to have a lot of fun because there's so much in Daniel that's prophecy. And I know people are chomping at the bit to dig into prophecy and to hear at Grace Church how everything going on in governments in the Middle East applies to being fulfillments of Daniel. You might be disappointed. But we'll dig in and roll up our sleeves and see what we can see. So I'm looking forward to that. Now, if you were here on Sunday, or if you weren't here on Sunday, it was a phenomenal time this last week where we had all three of our services simultaneous in the same room at the same time, simultaneously. But we had baptisms, we had communion, and it was packed. And it was really fun because we had the missionary speakers, Brandon and Melinda Dockham, and they got to do the bilingual message, which was great. But it was fun also to kind of have all of us pastors take turns with a smaller piece of the service. So I got to get up and do communion. John got to go up and lead baptisms. Ali got to lead baptisms. Gino got to do the opening. And it was just kind of a fun, like, team service across the board. And the music was great. And the celebration of baptisms was great. I got a picture from the balcony that might be one of my favorite pictures I've ever taken because you had the full tank and it had spilled. It was after the baptism. So there was some water on the carpet around. Always okay. And then the communion tables were there and all the trays and elements were used. So I had this picture of everybody worshiping and singing and a baptism tank that had been used and communion trays that had been used. And I just thought, that's the church. That's the church. And especially to have it in multiple languages. And I even thought too, Edward grew up in the Caribbean islands in South America and the islands off the coast there of North South America. And so he's up there leading worship. And you have all of the Latino folks there as well. And it was just kind of like, it's not just Mexico and the United States here. We've got all sorts of nations represented and in the room, and then to have the Dockhams, from Costa Rica, and he grew up in Bolivia. And, it's just kind of like international doesn't just mean Mexico and the United States. And I love that we're able to expand even in that, even though we only still had the two languages, there was a lot more represented there of the nations. And I very much like that. So that was fun. And we're going to do 3 more Super Sundays this year. We just had a big calendar meeting with our staff. And so looking forward to those coming up later on. What else can we talk about? Oh, a big thing you should know if you're watching this and you're interested, our Wednesday nights are launching. And we have classes, we have children's stuff, we have youth stuff. We want to make it a big family night for people to come out. And of course, it's going to snow between now and then. So we don't even know if it's going to happen. That happened last year too. When we kicked off all our Wednesdays, it snowed every Wednesday. But we will not be deterred. Well, we might be a little deterred, but not in the long run. So please think about being a part of what we're doing on Wednesday nights as well as Sundays, because it's a really important place where discipleship happens. And the purpose of the church is to make disciples. And so that's where we're prioritizing a lot of time and energy and effort. So we'd love for you to come be a part of that if the weather holds, which it may not, but that's okay. God's in control of the weather, not me and not you. So be safe and warm, but also come on Wednesdays if we're having Wednesdays. I'm sure there's a lot more I could talk about, but it is time. It is 1:30. I am coming up on my half hour, and really, no one wants more than a half hour out of me, I hope. But if you do, come back for Thursday's announcement setup for the weekend, and then I'll be back next Tuesday, God willing, and the creek don't rise, to do another one of these breakdowns on Daniel 1. If you want to be reading ahead, Daniel chapter 1. Okay, for those of you who are watching now, you're awesome. Thanks for checking in. Those of you who watch later, which is going to be most of you, you are also awesome. Thanks for checking in later. And if you never watch this, you are awesome, made in the image of God, dearly loved by your Creator, and I hope somebody tells you. Thanks.